live on YouTube.
Welcome everyone to Conversations on Zoom or COZ 85. It's my great pleasure to introduce this wonderful panel and program for today. This is our last session of this season or this series, and we hope to reconnect our programs after the Jewish high holidays in late October. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce a colleague at UCLA, William Kinderman, who's a professor of music in the Elaine Crown Klein Chair in Performance Studies. Professor Kinderman has a very long and rich career. He's a formidable concert pianist and chamber musician and an international authority on the music and creative process of Ludwig van Beethoven. He has written many different engaged writings that are quite fascinating, and he has done some current work on Kurtág and its connection to Kafka, and it's really fascinating work. Bill and I were able to meet when he arrived at UCLA, which is in 2019, and then we haven't seen much of each other because of COVID. But it's wonderful that Bill's on our faculty, and we really look forward to a wonderful presentation. And to begin the presentation, I'll turn things over to Malcolm Miller.
Well, thank you to Mark for that. And I'd like to add my own words of introduction and welcome to William Kinderman, who's both a colleague and a friend. And I'm very privileged to have known Professor Kinderman for quite a while. I think it was in just around the millennium time, and he became the editorial chair of a journal which I'm editing, which is called Arietta, and it's a Beethoven journal. As Bill Kinderman is best known in a way for being an authority on the work of Beethoven, and particularly the creative process behind Beethoven's works, because of his sort of groundbreaking work on amongst other things, the Diabelli variations and many other things since that volume came out. And I was happy to discover there were many other points of contact in the musical world of research, particularly Bill's work on Wagner. He's produced a companion to Wagner's Parsifal. And then this interest in compositional process got him involved in this whole wider range of music, really going back into the 18th century and forward into the 20th and 21st centuries, and which is why we're here at the moment. So I don't want to spend too much time talking, but it's a really great opportunity here to hear from somebody who's spent their life's work really looking at sketches and drafts and process, and can shed light on the importance of those aspects to our understanding. But also, I had to say that actually his latest book, Bill's latest book, I have to sort of give a plug there, Beethoven, a Political Artist in Revolutionary Times, is a sort of way of expressing another aspect of music as not just the notes, but its sort of wider political and global relevance. I think that's what's really exciting about Bill's approach. So over to you, Bill. I'd like to just say how wonderful to talk about Kurtág, who I believe you actually know and have encountered sort of personally as a performer and as a musicologist. So I know we're going to talk about a particular piece of music, and but I mean, if we're doing this more or less, you're going to give a lecture, but we discussed, maybe I'll ask you just a few questions at the beginning. If you wanted to start, maybe talk about your own, how you encountered Kurtág, apart from how the process of coming to this particular topic of the Kafka Fragments, which of course is the focus of today's session.
Thank you very much, Malcolm, and thanks also to Mark for this very kind invitation. And just as I begin, let me also introduce my very able research assistant, Dr. Michael Stein, who is a composer, a graduate of the Distinguished Composition faculty here at UCLA, And here's Michael.
Good morning. Very happy to be here.
And as part of this conversations on Zoom, it's great that he can be here because we can share not only some material related to Kurtág's engagement with Franz Kafka, with some images, but we can be prepared to offer some sound examples, also coordinated with a score that has the English translation written in. And those score excerpts that you'll see later on are actually from the score used for performance purposes by Movses Pogossian, who's a distinguished violinist here at UCLA, our professor, senior professor of violin, who has also worked with Kurtág over the years and recently performed this monumental cycle just last March with the soprano Tony Arnold. And both of them have worked more than once with Kurtág. So to begin, here's a bit of background about this very impressive, almost legendary figure in music today, who is now 97 and still going strong, despite the passing a couple of years back of his beloved wife, Marta Kurtág, also of Jewish background, who was a very fine pianist and his artistic collaborator. And nothing was more characteristic of György or George Kurtág and his wife Marta than their communicating music in a live performance context. And also nothing was more characteristic of Kurtág's approach to music than for him to communicate his almost unrivaled firsthand knowledge of earlier music, reaching back to the Renaissance at least, or Middle Ages, and then forward to the very latest developments. In other words, Kurtág is sometimes described as the last of the avant-garde generation of composers, including Ligeti and Stockhausen and others. He's now 97, as we mentioned. And yet at the same time, it's interesting that in all his decades of activity in Budapest, and then in later times in Berlin and near Bordeaux, France, with his return to Budapest a number of years ago, that throughout that time, Kurtág occupied himself primarily as a fabulous pianist and a professor of piano and chamber music, and not of composition. And often declining opportunities to lecture, he would prefer to demonstrate firsthand with a strong orientation to texts and poetry and a knowledge of many languages in depth. Kurtág gravitated at a certain point to the legacy of Kafka, and that is also worth some comments. But as by way of introduction, let me show you some pictures of Kurtág in action. And our first image here, shows Kurtág with the soprano Tony Arnold to his right, to our left, and Movses Pogossian of the UCLA faculty on our right, Kurtág in the center. And this dates from the first period when they were working actively with him. And if we move on to the next image, you'll see Kurtág, and in the very center of the picture is his wife, now deceased, Marta Kurtág. And if we move to the next picture, there you see Movses Pogossian and Kurtág in action at the piano, directing Movses with great detail. I mean, with visceral, gritty detail, because Kurtág has such specific ideas about his music and the music of other composers too, Bach and Beethoven and all the rest, that sometimes leading quartets and musicians are actually a bit hesitant to work with him because, as they put it, they're sometimes afraid of getting stuck on the very first page, even if they're pieces that they have immersed themselves in for many years. And I might mention that I first got to know Kurtág better at a festival in Mondsee near Salzburg, Austria. It was the final festival organized by the distinguished pianist Andras Schiff, who himself has a close relationship to Kurtág and he regards Kurtág as one of his teachers. Well, around 1999, I was there in his presence for about 2 weeks. And the themes were Bach and Beethoven and Kurtág and Heinz Holliger, another living composer and virtuoso oboist, who's a composer as well. And it was at times quite amusing to see, however, how performers of Kurtág's music would studiously avoid the composer because even a quarter hour before a performance on a given evening, if Kurtág spied them, he would want to go over specific passages again in order to seek the unattainable and optimal performance. And if we move to the next image, there's a session where Kurtág is helping me with my performance of Beethoven's Diabelli Variations, another big cyclic work with which I've occupied myself. And you can see Kurtág, again, gesturally very much in action, indefatigable in his effort to achieve that sound image in his mind and spirit. And that's what is so fabulous, this unity of theory and practice, of imagined sound and artistic expression with actually doing it. So he's an artist, now 97, last of his generation, who's still active, also a composer whose magnum opus until a number of years ago was this very work under consideration, the Kafka Fragments. But it has now been, in a sense, succeeded by his opera based on Samuel Beckett's Endgame, or Fin de Partie, which came to the stage finally at La Scala just a few years ago. And so Kurtág has a very, very special place in this landscape. And so let's move on to a few comments by way of introduction to this cycle of 40 settings of Franz Kafka's works and its background. Now, first a little bit to Kafka. As you know, Kafka was of Jewish background, a famously innovative writer whose home was actually in Prague in the Czech Republic. And a friend of Kafka's was Max Brod, and Brod became Kafka's literary executor. So that when Kafka died in 1924, he gave some directions concerning the many notebooks and the many unpublished materials that he left. And actually, the directive was to destroy them. But Max Brod very wisely ignored Kafka's directions. And in those shadowy and tragic years of the 1930s, Brod was in control of these irreplaceable precious fragments from Kafka, very significant ones. In 1939, when the Nazis then are poised to take over Czechoslovakia, and thereby endangering Kafka's legacy. And Max Brod then was able to take to what later becomes Israel the materials which, as Malcolm pointed out to me, through a complex series of events are now in the National Library in Jerusalem. But the background of these, especially of Kafka's diaries, and this dates back to the period especially 1910 to 1913, are what became published by the early 1950s. And the famous composer Ligeti, whose music, even if you're not so familiar with the scene in modern classical music, you might know that important parts of the musical score of a work like Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey use the music of Ligeti. Well, Ligeti was there in Budapest as World War II ends. Both of these young composers were waiting for the return of Bela Bartok from New York, but Bartok unfortunately dies in 1945. And by the 1950s, Ligeti points out to Kurtág that indeed these Kafka fragments had become available, in other words, the diaries and other sources, and that they were really fascinating and important. And so Kurtág, in his patient and inquiring and probing manner, drew his attention to Kafka. And he describes this in some interviews that were later published. And he says that he found it difficult to gain entry to the fragments, but he gradually notated some of them, noting their profound compression, which is a character in his musical style, which he shares with the composer Anton von Webern, a significant influence on Kurtág too. And that Kurtág over the years collects these pieces, but cannot yet find a way of setting them effectively to music. And then he encounters the famous tale by Kafka, the Metamorphosis, or Die Verwandlung in Germany. And that you'll recall, that's the tale in which Gregor Samsa, the protagonist, who is at work, he's a kind of traveling salesman figure supporting an eccentric family at home, hating his job. And Gregor Samsa, whose last name reminds us of samsara, kind of a philosophical idea as well, he is transformed in the very first sentence of this tale, certainly one of the most celebrated and fascinating opening sentences in any work of literature, that he finds himself after dark dreams transformed into an enormous insect with a hard shell and many kind of feet, a kind of dung beetle in a large format. And this image, which is so rich and which also, of course, conveys symbolically his alienation from his surroundings, this was clearly a tale that unlocked Kafka for Kurtág. And that image of animalistic transformation also plays a role, as we'll see later in this great set of this great cyclic work of 40 songs lasting about an hour in performance time. Other aspects of the metamorphosis also clearly play a role. For instance, Gregor Samsa, for most of the tale, is kind of locked in his room. But he's very musical. And he is drawn out of his room by the violin playing of his sister at a later point. demonstrating his kind of musical sensitivity. And I think this is clearly connected to Kurtág's decision, which was a decision early in his setting of these texts, that following the model of a work like Franz Schubert's famous Winterreise, or the Winter's Journey from 1827, there would be a collection of poetic settings in musical form that are in some respects a metaphor for life itself. But at the same time, he replaces the traditional role of the pianist here by the violin, which is treated in a very creative fashion throughout, a kind of path-breaking treatment of the solo violin, together with the soprano, which is also, the soprano voice is treated very creatively here. But the choice of using the violin in one of those songs, it's even two violins that is employed, like a different instrument needs to be taken up by the performer and who moves from one side of the stage to the other. And we could return to this later. But let me just point out in passing an interesting experience I had where I had to think of this complex background. And it's when I performed publicly Beethoven's longest cyclic work, kind of Beethoven's counterpart to Kurtág's Kafka Fragments, in the city of New Orleans some years back. And here I am, I'm nearing the end of the performance. So about 50 minutes or 45 minutes in, playing the slow portion before the final couple of variations. And I suddenly notice a movement on the stage. And I'm a bit surprised by this, but it being a slow variation, I can afford a glance to my right, and I see an especially large roach, a very big black roach. And so I play to the end, but in the spirit of Kurtág's Kafka, I was rather fascinated that a large roach would apparently respond musically to Beethoven in such a sensitive way, and then come on stage and be my companion in this performance. But then when the performance was over, and I mentioned this to some people, including one of the organizers, a lady with high heels, she suddenly, out of embarrassment and impulse, grabs her high heel and squashes the music-loving insect, which parallels, by the way, the end of Kafka's imaginative tale, The Metamorphosis, where Gregor Samsa, in the form of this enormous kind of dung beetle shape, is eventually picked up and tossed away. So this is one part of my own longer engagement with this fascinating work. And then when I had the occasion, as Malcolm mentioned, of writing a book that would traverse the creative process of a number of major composers, and I devoted chapters to Mozart and Beethoven, Schumann and Mahler and Bartók. Then I found the last composer in this series could very well be György Kurtág, especially because that gave me the opportunity to interview him about the genesis of the piece. So if I could, let's proceed here and just try to gain a quick overview here. And as you'll see, if we go back one slide, tile 1 means part 1. And then you see die guten Gehen im gleichen Schritt, or the good march in steady steps. That's the very first song setting, and it displays a couple of very striking things about the work immediately, including you could put it a Kafka, a Kafka-like or Kurtágian irony, because the good marching in steady steps, as we recognize, are not exactly the good at all. Maybe one has to think of the Russian soldiers in the Ukraine at the moment following orders, whereas it's the not the good, but the others who dance the dances of time, which point in an artistic direction. And so in this very concise opening song, Kurtág, selecting Kafka's concise text, already launches it with these ideas in mind. And the idea of a steady path, or Weg in German, is critiqued in various ways. In other words, that a steady, self-confident path forward, we must conclude, is extremely problematic if it does exist. And so looking through these further songs, we see in part one quite a collection, and some of these are based on contrast between adjacent settings, and we'll have a chance to look at that more closely. If we move to part two, we'll see that part two is indeed called Der wahre Weg, or the true path, and we'll have occasion later to look at this in more detail. The true path has a really big question mark over it. And then in part three, these settings tend to be longer, but also belong together in a meaningful sequence, which is nevertheless open. Important here is also the setting of Der begrenzte Kreis, so the closed circle you see toward the center of part three, which has a double in another work of Kurtág's, an homage to Robert Schumann. And we can have occasion to talk about this later. And then if we get to part four, we'll notice the last of these settings has the text, the moonlit night dazzled us. And the very last part of this, this is actually drawn from the wedding preparations in the country, an incomplete Kafka text, which Brode also rescued. And it has the image at the end of two serpents creeping through the dust. And we'll return to this and listen to it later. But Kurtág and his wife Marta were known, and my colleague Movses Pogossian would describe this on occasion, how to display the implications and meaning of this final text, the two of them would suddenly throw themselves down on the floor and move like serpents. Because here we have a kind of animalistic transformation too. And I think part of the point is it's the inversion of the Kafkaesque image with Gregor Samsa, here placed at the very end of the cycle as a kind of way of signing it. Kurtág signing it by displaying himself in the picture as a serpent, and his wife Marta, his treasured collaborator as well. And the animalistic transformation even extends to the first part of the text, where there are a lot of birds in the trees, and the Czech version of Kafka refers to a dark kind of crow-like bird. And so Kafka, in a sense, is present also in this strange, uncanny landscape. Now, if we move forward from this, this is a quick review of aspects of the genesis of the piece. And this is not in Kurtág's hand. you can see the titles of some of these pieces. But they're actually in the hand of Andras Wilhelm, a friend and collaborator in Hungary, a good pianist and a kind of music scholar. And he helped Kurtág, and they reminded me, actually, in studying the genesis of the piece, that when Kurtág found himself able to set these to music in the mid-1980s, one piece after another, that he was intensely involved with the individual settings, and he knew that the good moving in step, that processional opening song, would go first. And he knew that the long setting, the non-fragment that we'll examine based on the true path, would be somewhere in the middle. And he knew that that last piece with the two serpents would be at the end. But otherwise, he was somewhat at a loss as to how to organize them. And then hence got help from others in collaborating. And then if we look, this is a quick glance at Kurtág's manuscript for one of these settings that has a single word, rualos. In other words, without peace. In other words, in constant motion, sort of like that one figure in Beckett's Endgame who's constantly in motion. And you can see how Kurtág writes this is his draft for the piece with some revisions. And if we move to the next stage, you see the printed version. And it starts with his comment that the piece is a kind of pantomime in which the singer also needs to mirror the acrobats of the violinist. And this reminds us of the very theatrical and symbolic aspects of these pieces. Ruelos, the word at the end, is just spoken, no longer sung. And so it needs special notation. And then if we move to the next piece as an example, this is another one that I found in Basel, where all the Kurtág manuscripts are kept. It's very nice setting, actually, based on this Kafka text. You are the assignment. No student, far and wide. In other words, this is in the tradition of what the Germans might call a Dinggedicht, a kind of ode, in which the you refers to the assignment, the goal, in a sense, the path, but which is not really entirely attainable. And therefore, there is an assignment, there's a goal, but sort of nobody ready to take up that path. And you can see how Kurtág approaches this very intensely. If we look at the next setting, this is actually one that might have found a home early in the cycle because it's based on this idea of the good and the questioning idea of the good. But you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 settings with 2 of them having question marks for the violin part at a certain point, and that shows Kurtág's own questioning and probing a treatment of this. And then he even dates this draft 1985. If we move to the next setting, we return to Du bist die Aufgabe, you are the task or the assignment. And you can see Kurtág working out the harmonies and the text setting. If we move to the very next one, now we get to a draft dated and actually complete. So complete that it would have fit very well into the cycle. And it's a very interesting one, but it's totally unknown except for exploring these archives, because it didn't get included among the 40 other cycles. And I even pointed this out to Kurtág, and then he seemed slightly surprised. Maybe he had even partly forgotten that in the process of arranging these pieces, 1 or 2 of them maybe got left behind that were still worthy. And I had, as a graduate student, a doctoral project, Shin-A Kim, a Korean violinist, and Ingrid Kanmin, soprano, make a recording of it. So here, this is a rare occasion to hear a Kurtág fragment that virtually nobody knows. This is how it sounds. So just a couple quick comments about this. It's what's typical of Kurtág, or that we typically need to find our own way into each of these very meaningful and compressed settings. And so the treatment, the interaction of the voice and the violin, the details of text setting, the pregnant silences that you notice, say, at the beginning of the fourth bar there, with the repetition of Kein Schüler, the close connection to the meaning of the words, like weit, with the long span, for instance. All of these aspects kind of reflect the character of Kafka's texts, which, even if they're only a couple of sentences, usually carry complex resonances and provoke us to reflection. And if we now move forward past this, we get to a series of examples. This one, here's another example that displays the compression of this. Einen Augenblick lang fühlte ich mich umpanzert, which means for one moment long, I felt myself fortified. Now this is, as you see, a very short setting, but it's fascinating that Augenblick, or moment, is juxtaposed with lang, in other words, long. Moment is something that means something short. So you have the shortness and the longness in play that's already present in the interesting harmonic span of the violin, and that long note that you see with the mark over it right there. And then fühlte ich mich umpanzert. Well, in German, umpanzert, a panzer is a tank. So one thinks of Gregor Samsa again, actually, that for a moment I felt that I was armored, you'd have to say. So even though it's only a sprinkling, a handful of words, it's sort of amazing how much is in it. So it encourages us to think about these pieces, to have us contaminate our inner world in such a way that we can't easily forget them. Even the open gesture at the end on the augmented triads is like that. And then if we move quickly to the next image, again, great compression, sleeping, or slept, awoke, slept, awoke, slept, awoke, and then at the end, wretched life. In other words, the idea that we're sleeping and we're waking, and that itself is a recurrent cycle. And from the perspective of alienation, this repetitive cycle is looked at with a certain resistance or disdain. This paradoxical miniature was important enough to Kurtág, by the way, that he doubles it. In other words, the same text appears more than once, which gives a cyclic aspect within the cycle. And if we move to the next example, yeah, that's the end of that song, Elendes Leben, wretched life. And then we move beyond that. Here's one with the text, the viewers, or the onlookers, are frozen when the train goes past them. And you can see, just looking visually at the violin, drum, 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 drum. That's the impression of a speeding train through the station, of perceiving each car as it passes by. And then the point of this pithy fragment is that the onlookers are frozen in time. They're frozen on the platform, but the train is speeding by them. So it's a kind of paradoxical moment. And that's what Kurtág has captured in this setting. And if we move to the next, and here's another example of paradox. Es gibt ein Ziel. There is a goal, and you see the goal is right after that vertical line. So in other words, it's emphasized rhythmically, but the text continues, but there's no way to it. What we call a way is just delay. It's just hesitation. And so zögern, you can see it just visually there, it is itself prolonged to embody the sense of delay. In other words, immediacy, while we've said there's no goal, but there is a way. The path is the way. The process is the way. And there's a profound skepticism about goals, as we can explore further. And then here, this is the one that maybe embodies that most of all. The true path goes over a kind of suspended wire or suspended rope that causes us to stumble rather than progress it past it. And the image here, if you just look at it again visually, you don't even have to read music to understand this in a sense. You see the soprano line is very low, at the very bottom of what a soprano can manage. And then you can hear, when we listen to this later, that the violin is treated contrapuntally with two lines. One of them is above the soprano, one of them is below it, at the very bottom of the violin possibility, which reaches only to that lowest, the very first note. And so it turns out that this very slow setting of this non-fragment, it takes 7 minutes in performance, is sort of like a rope walker. It's sort of like the soprano is balancing precariously on this rope. And so this again broadcasts the immediacy of the experience, and it negates, or at least broadcasts, a profound skepticism about a deterministic viewpoint in which we're moving from A to Z. We're moving deterministically and confidently toward a goal. And it's characteristic that Pierre Boulez, the famous composer of this avant-garde generation, who did sometimes advocate a deterministic view, that Kurtág takes the trouble, he says, it's an homage, but it's a message. So it's a respectful critique, essentially, of Boulez, but offered in a friendly spirit. And then if we move through these sequence to the last one, yeah, we've already talked about that one. Here's the very last one. And you see just at a glance, the really virtuosic writing here, which is shared by the soprano and the violin, kind of like an incredible sitar improvisation or something like that, with the setting almost in a jungle scene, as we mentioned, with Kafka maybe lurking symbolically as a bird in the trees. And then we move to the very last page of this, and then we get to the last words of all, Wir krochen durch den Staub. And Staub, again, leaves the realm of song to go to be just spoken at the bottom of the range of the singer. And then there's another pregnant pause, and then sung in the final moments, ein Schlangenpaar, a pair of snakes. And that's where, with the open ending and the violin high up, that we have this image of a pair of snakes progressing further. And as one part of its meaning is this playful coordination with George and Marta Kurtág themselves. But of course, this is not a reduction to that. It's only a demonstration of one of the applications of the meaning. And I notice that my rambling forth has taken approximately 45 minutes. So I think maybe what we can do is proceed with some more in-depth discussion, and I can respond to any comments that Malcolm has at this point, and we can also leave some time for open discussion.
Well, so firstly, thank you, fantastic discussion. Thank you for that wonderful account and overview and this detailed, in fact, discussion of much of the music to build. So what I'd like to do, I would like to suggest is that, you've described the music so much. There is a lot to discuss, obviously, but I do feel it might be nice to actually hear some of the music, perhaps, and that you've discussed, just to hear even some of them. Of course, some of these 40 songs are very short, very brief. Some of them, maybe 30 seconds or so. And then you have the one song, which is the part 2, which is actually 7 minutes. And maybe that might be a little bit long. I don't know what people will feel, but maybe we can hear some of it at least, where you're talking about the low registers and that different sort of scale of activities. Things that I particularly, Bill, I'd like to sort of, maybe should we start with that sort of illustration, because I do feel that you've pointed out musical, things that we're used to in song cycles. Of course, Kurtág himself did actually write quite a few song cycles, and this comes under that. This is different in the sense that instead of the usual piano accompaniment, you have a violin, which is quite radical. And you explained the connection with that. The other thing is the aphoristic nature of Kurtág's art, because I feel, I know people might know, for example, his piano pieces, the Játékok, the games piece, which has sort of gone into 10 volumes by now, and it sort of extends from the 1970s, and that he used to play when I saw him. I remember at the South Bank with Marta together playing that set of pieces, which has a sort of playful element, maybe, because it was maybe originally conceived for children, but in fact is for serious contemplation as well. And they're very short, some very short pieces as well. They're sort of volumes of, so he particularly likes, I think, to do these, the miniatures, that comes into the musical form. But should we just listen to one or two of these songs and then talk about the ones that you haven't yet mentioned, particularly since it's a Jewish music forum, that they're both, that a couple of the songs are explicitly about Jewish matters, themes.
Okay, so let's look at a few of those, and we could start with the very first song.
Yeah.
Die Guten gehen im gleichen Schritt. So, and we said a little bit about that. The steady, unchanging pace is reflected in the violin part even before we hear the voice, which mirrors it a perfect fifth higher. And then the dances of time are in contrast to that. So let's just hear the first song.
Bill, before you do it, I'm just wondering whether I have the text here. Should I just quickly read the aphorism in an English translation? Is that possible?
Sure, you can. There it is also in what we're going to play. It's handwritten above the German, so it may be visible. And I might mention this performance is if it's Tony Arnold soprano, Movses Pogossian violin, and this is Movses Pogossian's score, in which he has written the English above the German.
Well,
if you want to
yes, okay, yeah.
the
good march in step, unaware of them, the others dance around them, the dances of time.
I think part of the meaning or implication here too is that those steady steps are in a sense eternally present as an idea, and it's as if their constancy means we start to hear them at the beginning of that song and we cease to hear them at the end, but in some way they're lurking in the background all along. Now, why don't we move to two songs next to one another, number 13 and number 14. And number 13, as Kurtág himself points out, is set like a Hasidic dance. It's one of those songs that has then an explicitly Jewish connection. And the text, once I broke my leg, it was the most beautiful experience of my life. So it has an ironic element, the apparent breaking of the leg coupled with the most beautiful experience. Of course, there's the common expression too, break a leg. And the very spirited setting here also carries the direction with humor. And of course, the topic of Jewish humor is a rich subject as well. And when we follow to number 14, we'll go right to 14 after it. This is the one, a moment long I felt myself with enamored or armored. And that's the one that I related to the Gregor Samsa idea of the animalistic transformation of Gregor Samsa as a kind of gigantic, grotesque dung beetle figure. So here are these two songs, numbers 13 and 14 from part one. And now maybe one more example. I'll hold back the two longest examples we would have ready for now.
Bill,
yeah.
we didn't have the Panzert yet.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. with the trick that that figure in the violin, of course, the very last time, and only the very last time, it goes up and into the silence at the end of the piece. Many subtleties like this. Now, number 18 is Träumend hing die Blume. It's an homage to Robert Schumann. And if any of you know Schumann's famous song cycle, Dichterliebe, that opens with a similar interval, a deliciously dissonant but sensuously communicative interval of the minor ninth. And this Kurtág sets in the violin in a very high position. And this is, the text goes, "Yeah, dreaming the flower was hanging or was suspended on its high stem as the twilight embraced it." And the sensuousness of this setting, kind of the consolation of beauty embodied in the flower, is reflected in this very sensitive setting. And at the same time, we won't take the time to hear it, but the very next setting, number 19, is the strongest possible negation. Nothing of the sort. 9, 9, no, no. And so Kurtág, to gain energy and to set up a kind of expressive or philosophic polarity, here and elsewhere, he puts the consolation of beauty and pits it directly against the resistance and the negation of a problematic outward reality. So here's number 18, Träumend hing die Blume. So there are several examples. It would be nice to hear a little more of Kurtág's music before we adjourn, but maybe that answers your call for a few of the pieces, Malcolm.
Yeah, I was. I mean, I think we probably would have just a few minutes just to hear maybe the beginning of the slow one, but and there's the one other Jewish allusion, put it that way, in the part 3, number 10, which is entitled Penetrant Jüdisch. Oh, and there are various translations of the word penetrant. In one I've read it in one program, offensively Jewish, and I think you suggested insistently Jewish. And I'm reading one here in another CD note saying overpoweringly Jewish. There are lots of, whatever the word is.
It's interesting. That one has 2 versions, and the performers need to choose one or the other. The ending of the one is a little more insistent than the other.
And so we could actually try and hear that one. I don't know if it's something we could, listen to the slow, the big, maybe a few, maybe that one. But what I wanted to say actually, to talk, because we actually just you introduced the Hasidic one, and I just read that one of Kurtág's early teachers, when he was in Hungary in the late 1939, 1940, during the war, he survived in Timișoara in Romania, isn't it? Is it? And he was studying with Mihaly Iskevich. Is it Iskevich? I'm not sure how you pronounce it. But the person that he was studying with was apparently, and I read this in the foreword, by the way, a very interesting article, an New York-based publication, saying that he had written a book on Hasidic music and was very much in favor of the nigun, the Hasidic melody, wordless melody. That this teacher of Kurtág, when he was presumably 14, 15, teenage years, so perhaps there's an influence when he comes to write sort of 30 plus years later, that there's something of the influence there of his early teacher. I mean, and the other thing was, I mean, obviously the allusions to penetrant Jüdisch and the Hasidic, and possibly I was thinking well, you mentioned a sitar in the last song, and I was wondering whether maybe it's the cimbalom also. Did you ever consider, because he actually uses a cimbalom in his earlier song cycles? He actually did use a cimbalom in one of his earlier song cycles.
In my writings about this, I've referred to the sitar in part because Kurtág himself referred to it, but but often he draws on multiple sources at once, and what you say is convincing. Just concerning examples and looking at the amount of time, maybe we should hold
the examples and open it to the floor. Perhaps we can.
Maybe we can, because my assistant has to leave soon, but maybe we could queue it up so that before we adjourn, we could hear the Der wahre Weg. In other words, the important setting that occupies the whole second part, the true path, using quarter tones. And
should we do that now?
I guess we could do it now, and then how much of it would you want to hear? We could hear the whole setting and then turn it up to questions, and then we just agree we've heard enough music, because I'd be left without Michael assisting, but we probably will have plenty to discuss.
I mean, what we could do is ask everyone to think of your questions, maybe place it in the chat box or have them in reserve for when this finishes, and then we can go straight into a discussion. How about that?
Let's do it that way. So this is, as I mentioned, the true path. It has a rather remarkable treatment of the violin in its lower register, but with 2 voices at once. It's a very slow setting. It's the one that has the critique of determinism, in the sense that the true path actually is not really a path at all, but it's more like the protagonist suspended on a rope that is more um, kind of designed more to cause stumbling, to cause problems. And so the kind of symbolic, almost pictorial dimension here is of the voice part very low down, and then the precarious balancing of the violin lines below and above it. And this is embodied through the use of quarter tones. In other words, not the semitones that you know, say, from the piano, but actually shortening those tonal distances to quarter tones. So there we have it. That's there's some sense of consolation or resolution with that final sound at the end, which reaches a tenth. After the kind of sense of struggle, ambiguity, of out-of-tuneness, which is characteristic of the precarious balance between the violin parts.
Thanks very much, Bill. I think we have a slight sound problem at the moment. I don't know if anyone else is experiencing it. There's a very, very loud hiss on my end. I'm just wondering where it's coming from.
It's not evident here from my perspective. But
it's just stopped. So it just stopped. So that solved that one. Anyway, but that it is a very, particularly the placing, I think. And when you mentioned right at the beginning, this idea of how did he organize the sequencing of, I mean, it's a fascinating idea, you know, what drove him to use that particular sequence. And we can see obviously pairings and things like that working very well. But that right in the middle of this set has a really strong effect, and then it sort of takes off again, and there's a theatricality. I don't know if anyone's seen who's present here has sort of been to a performance of this. I mean, I went to one which was very memorable at the festival hall, and there was a sort of enacted, you know, there's this sort of ballet going on with the violinists sort of dance, you know, and the dancing and moving across the stage at a particular moment. And I remember whoever organized the concert actually made a thing of that and actually brought the audience very, very close to the performers, knowing that there is this, Kurtág wants this sort of visceral balletic type of relationship between the performer and the audience, you know, to sort of
very much
part
so.
Of the experience. Yeah.
There's this one piece, it's a scene in the electric car with this singer who's back at the time when electric streetcars were new is accompanied by two different violinists, and that's particularly colorful and theatrical. There's even been a staged version of the Kurtág Fragments with staging by Peter Sellers that was done in New York some years back.
Wow. Okay. Well, listen, I've got lots more to say, but I think I shouldn't, and I think I'd like to open it up because we have a wonderful audience here, to invite anyone to make comments and ask questions and the way we normally do it. So I don't know, I can perhaps chair it. I've seen a hand go up. It's Charles, first of all, who I can't see, but I can probably hear in a minute.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you. So wait a minute, I'll move into the light. So first of all, it was a wonderful presentation. Yes, I have heard the piece performed live. I got a few comments. First of all, I think this penetrant Juden surely is translated as pushy Jews, would probably be this. I don't know if you think that would be a good translation.
No.
Pushy Jews says it all, and it's also extremely offensive. It's a code. It's an anti-Semitic code. What you mentioned about this, I wonder if this is the book. This is the thing that you were talking about. It says here Max Isakovets, which is a phenomenal. I have this publication. It's called Songs of the Masters. Is this who we're talking about? Was this?
Yeah.
This is an absolutely beautiful, beautiful, published in New York a few years ago. These are so moving Hasidic nigunim in a beautiful, beautiful modernistic pianist version. And because in Maramoresh, like Bartok loved all the, I'm working through the 44 duos of Bartok. And I always have fun with the Maramoresh, however you pronounce it. It's just so Hasidic. Anyway, but one thing, I have a question. Here's my question. I was at a workshop with Barbara Hannigan, and she worked with Kurtág. And she said that she found some of his directions imprecise. And when she asked Kurtág about them, he just became very irritated and he was difficult to, she found him difficult to work with. And Barbara Hannigan is just an absolutely outstanding, but I just wonder what you would say about that.
No, Barbara Hannigan is amazing. And her sense of presence and the vivid characterization is just remarkable. I'm not surprised. My experience, and I know that of my colleague Movses Pogossian in working with Kurtág, was extremely positive, but I'm quite aware that some ensembles and musicians do find him difficult. And my friend Movses Pogossian has also said that when they would when they returned to Kurtág for coaching, they would find that certain comments he made seemed to contradict what he had previously said. Although the thought is also that he might have sometimes thought that they needed a different sort of input, and therefore gave them advice and directions from a different perspective that seemed to contradict, but didn't ultimately contradict. Kurtág is, he has very strong feelings about how something is to be presented, and Barbara Hannigan has very strong feelings about projection and what she can do. And so my suspicion is that you have two very strong artistic figures who butt heads.
Okay.
And it's not surprising.
Okay, thanks.
And for instance, Peter Sellers is a very bold and audacious and talented stage director. But Kurtág did not like his staging of the Kafka Fragments. So Kurtág, like many artists like that, he's very vivid in interaction, but he has strong impressions, and in working with musicians who are very seasoned as performers. It's not at all surprising that they would sometimes come into conflict. Another reason for conflict with Kurtág as a coach is that some ensembles, say string quartets, may have a very long experience with pieces that they would tend to offer him, and would find it difficult to rethink their basic assumptions. But then Kurtág, if he's a different viewpoint, he would insist upon that. He would not compromise. And so I know that some musicians in working with him will actually avoid him, even though he's a remarkable coach.
Thank you.
Shall we move to Agnes? So you've had your hand up as well. And then after that, Ronit, welcome.
Am I unmuted now?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so I was going to ask two questions and make one comment. One of my questions more or less has just been answered in this dialogue in the last few minutes. I was going to ask what was Kurtág like with you and with your friend and when you worked together, because in Hungary I witnessed him like being quite, I don't know what word to use, not the kindest person when he's coaching, and I was wondering whether it's just reserved to Hungarians. But what you said answered the question that it just depends whom he's working. But just a tiny little anecdote to finish this bit. I think it was 3 years ago, pre-COVID, I sat through a session which he coached, and Peter Ötvös was there, and there was an ensemble who did Ötvös and Kurtág and that sort of thing, and the solo singer, and Hungarian solo singer, and I thought that Kurtág was absolutely horrible to the solo singer in front of an audience. I was in tears about it, and I wrote to Peter Ötvös saying that, great evening, but what a pity that Kurtág was so horrible to this girl. And Peter Ötvös wrote back and said, what? No, that was at his kindest, and he likes this girl very much. So it's, that's that. Now, the other question, which is still remains a question, Kurtág wrote the Kafka Fragments for violinist András Keller, and András Keller contributed quite a bit. That is my understanding. So I'm wondering if your friend worked with András Keller, or whether he was just going independently. And my comment, by the way, it's very nice playing. I'm just wondering whether it was with or without András Keller. And my comment is about the very, very, very strong relationship between Marta and György Kurtág, which was amazing over the decades. And the two of them playing Bach is like being in heaven. So, it's just amazing. But it has to be said that Kurtág had very strong relationships with other people as well. And Rima Dalos, the Russian poet, was one of those very, very, very strong relationships with Kurtág. At the same time, while Kurtág was having a very strong relationship with Marta. And we have the songs which Kurtág wrote for on Rima's poems, and Boulez recorded them. So it's just, I feel a little bit like slightly irritated when I hear about the wonderful relationship between Marta and György Kurtág, when I know that he had other important relationships as well. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to your answer to my actual question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comments. And I might mention the singer that we were listening to in these last examples, Tony Arnold, that in the recording that they made, and also online, if you look, Movses Pogossian with Tony Arnold, you will find part of a rehearsal with Kurtág, and Marta is present, and all of the things that you point out are present. In that you see how Tony Arnold has been rehearsing at length with Kurtág. Kurtág is not satisfied. He's quite relentless, actually, and she continues and continues, and then at the very point that she kind of sits down to get a break, she breaks out in tears. She is really exhausted and has had too much and cannot really continue. She's emotionally drained and surely also frustrated that Kurtág was not satisfied. And at that point, Marta actually, you can see this in the video, she points this out to Kurtág, and Kurtág then goes and embraces Tony Arnold, but only after Marta points it out, and that the situation is that Kurtág, he, like I think some other musicians of this persuasion, that they are the opposite of what we might call in modern parlance politically correct. Kurtág is not at all that way. He is not paying attention to the way, kind of the educational method of delivery. He is concerned about attaining what he thinks is necessary artistically. And so even if the performer tries it many, many, many times, it can easily happen that he remains fundamentally dissatisfied and will express that. And so that's, I think, and I think actually that that this, with some musicians in the past, was more common than maybe today. For instance, we know from the sources that Beethoven's student Ferdinand Ries related that he once was having a lesson with Beethoven on Beethoven's variation set opus 34, and there was a little cadenza-like passage, and Ries says he played it for Beethoven 30 or 35 times, and Beethoven remained dissatisfied, unhappy with it. And so I think it's also a situation in public master classes, if the performers at all have their ego on the line, it's sort of awkward to play and revise and try again and try 10 times and still not succeed. But you can take the view that in a way, if a experienced musician is going to be that caring and aiming at almost the unattainable, that also has a value. And I think that's unfashionable, but I think in a way something to be welcomed. And so that's part of your question. You asked about Andras Keller. When I was anxious to make contact with all the original performers, Adriana Cengari, the original soprano who sang, I was able to interview her and learn a lot about her career as an opera singer, which is connected to the way the voice part is written. She had a good low range too, and a good dramatic flair. Andras Keller, a violinist who worked very closely with Kurtág, to the extent that you can notice in the score, at one point, Kurtág makes reference to Keller vibrato.
Yes.
That the particular kind of idiomatic way that Keller would play was incorporated into the very substance. It's like he needed a virtuoso violinist to show him what the limits are, what's possible, because some of the things he writes are on the very verge of what's no longer possible. So I think maybe that partly explains that, the performance realizations are pretty challenging. And of course, they can be realized in different ways. But Kurtág was has the reputation of being pretty hard to please at times. So I was a bit surprised that when I played through the Diabelli variations, now I had already recorded the work and played it a great deal, but I was almost surprised that he wasn't harder on me.
Okay. So did your violinist colleague had any cooperation from András Keller, or was it just an independent?
No, he didn't. And no, I'm not, I've been in Hungary, but I'm not sufficiently integrated into the scene to know. I have never met András Keller personally. I just know András Schiff, for example, seems to have a mixed relationship to András Keller. That might have to do with the state of politics in Hungary too. And in that sense, I mean, András Schiff, for instance, refuses to play in Hungary, whereas Kurtág, who has weathered for such a long time so many changing circumstances, seems to have had no great hesitations when Martin needed medical treatment and they decided it was best to go back to Budapest, to go there. So it sounds like you know quite a lot about that context yourself.
Yeah, I know the two András quite well, both András, and I know Kurtág from a distance.
Yeah, the last time, a number of years ago, I was in Budapest and I visited him at the music center where they have an apartment.
That's right.
Marta was still living at that time, and it was a lovely evening, and Kurtág showed me as well the materials for his opera, which had not yet reached the stage. He is very hard on himself too. The opera was awaited for so many years. It was under contract with Salzburg, and then because Kurtág was not satisfied himself, it was delayed and delayed, and Kurtág, with his typical ironic glance, would also maybe subtly remind one that it is, after all, endgame.
Yeah.
And it is also his endgame. And I remember him telling me that even after it's staged, he's going to continue working on it. In other words, it's not completely finished. It will never be completely finished. He has an open vision of the artwork, that it's a process, a demanding process, and artistic projects are never quite finished and closed off.
At which point I might just interject that although this conversation will actually also not close off, I might just divert it slightly, but it was really, really fascinating to hear from Agnes and from your background and everything and stories. I'd like to move on, if I may, Bill, to Ronit Setter, who's joining us, and then after that, Marsha. Ronit, who's very well versed in matters of Israeli music as much as lots of other things. So Ronit, welcome. Do you want to, if you unmute, please? Can you unmute? Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good idea to unmute. Thank you. Thank you, Agnes. That was wonderful to hear about Marta and Kurtág, György. I saw them at the Library of Congress, and I actually came after a concert where they played together. That was an amazing experience. And at that occasion, I also asked them about Israeli composer André Haidou, who was friends with both of them, actually, Kurtág and Ligeti. Which brings me to my question, which is a little bit more general. It's not specific to the Kafka Fragments. And thank you again, Bill, for the wonderful presentation, but more general about style of these three composers, if we can call them three. At least Haidou presented that as such. I'm talking about Ligeti's etudes from the 80s, mid 80s, and the Haidou Yadikok, and later the fragments. I'm talking about moment form and about the general style, and because it's quite fascinating. I taught some ligeti, and it's not modern. It's definitely not postmodern as what was common after Rochberg, after the mid-70s, right? It's unistylistic generally. And it's does not, the style of Kafka Fragments and the Yatekok and Ligetis etudes, and actually Haidu, about 200 short pieces that he wrote, they are unistylistic, they are modern, they don't have the density of the avant-garde, and they have a little bit a sense of beauty that actually does not come from sonorism and of the French style at the time, spectralism. So what can you say about the style, specifically about these moment forms beyond Kurtág himself? As compared to Ligeti etudes, I think that's I think the source, and other pieces like that which are short, concise, emphasize beauty, and are not with some tonal anchors, and do not express the atonal density of the 60s and 70s?
It's a fascinating question that would require a longer time frame to address adequately. But I completely agree with you. They're moment forms that are capable of expansion. Like that last example is no longer a fragment, and typically, like some of the other shorter examples, when we reach the last section of that piece, Der wahre Weg, it strongly recalls the beginning, which I think is a kind of circularity typical of Kurtág's approach, that even in a very compressed framework, maybe reminiscent of Webern in some ways, the content can point outward beyond itself so that the moment form encompasses more than moments. And as you point out, the beauty, in other words, the aesthetic sensitivity is very pronounced. I thought that Schumann one with the image of the flower is one example among others of that tendency with Kurtág. In other words, sensuousness plays a real role. Close attention to the texts plays a big role. It's a kind of parallel quest for finding meaning in tones that in far-reaching ways parallel the meaning of other artistic idioms, of human experience. I think it's human experience. There's a certain rejection of abstraction, I think. Kurtág, I think, does not like, as sometimes happens in music of the last century, music that would be too systematic. In Beethoven's words, that would be too much like skeletons without flesh. And it's not postmodern in the sense of it being merely an eclectic array. There's some kind of a visceral concentration there, and I think it has to do with his deep immersion in the music of the past, his deep knowledge of Bach, Schubert, Beethoven, Schumann, all the rest of that tradition, and he somehow merges that tradition into a modern idiom so that it's not just historicist eclectic, and it defies categories. In other words, you can't pigeonhole it easily. Is that that's my quick attempt to answer your comment, which is really right on and very important.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's really fascinating. That's the problem, that the Ligeti talks about defining categories, and we as musicologists have to fight that also in a way. But anyway, and thank you so much for actually, I've been reading your work about Beethoven decades ago. So it's the one opportunity to say thank you.
Well, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Actually, if I could just come in on that, just to get back onto the Kurtág, what you were saying, I've found a lovely little quote from The Rest is Noise by Alex Ross on Kurtág, which I'm sure you know, when he says, Kurtág's music has to be, every description has to be qualified. It is compressed but not dense, lyrical but not sweet, dark but not dismal, quiet but not calm, etc., etc. And he sort of carries on quite nicely. So he's obviously pinpointed the same sort of problematic. And I remember also sort of, thinking myself, where does he fit? You don't want to pigeonhole, but on the other hand, you've pointed out quite a lot of what's involved there. And I mean, I think the theatricality or the spatial aspect is also sort of there, the performative aspect that Bill mentioned right at the start, actually, that's sort of also quite curiously about him. I just wanted to say, while Ronit is still here, there's and that's sort of harking on this, and I know we're reaching the end of the time, this sort of question of Kurtág's Judaism, because I mean, for many years, I was always aware of Ligeti, but Kurtág was sort of slightly more hidden away, and then at some point it sort of maybe became I was more alerted to the fact that Kurtág was also part of this. And I was actually privileged to have an interview with André Haidú when he was in London in 2011. In this interview, he had a very interesting thing to say, because he studied at the academy with and Kurtág. And basically, he was talking about himself. It was an interview about Haidú, and he won a prize for something he'd written under Kodai, a sort of a cantata based on a certain type of gypsy music, which wasn't very well known. And he said, if I'd stayed in Hungary, this is Haidú's words, I would have become, a leading composer of my generation. And then he said, well, but who would I have been alongside? He said, yes, well, there's sort of these people. Then also my friends, Kurtág and Ligeti, would have been like that. Then he said, and with Ligeti, he had a sort of break, as it were. They sort of went different ways, different directions, but he remained friends, very close friends with Kurtág. And then he described that at one point Kurtág wanted to come to Israel and had to do it in a sort of clandestine way, almost private. He was on a private visit, but he wasn't allowed to officially meet these sort of official, I suppose I suppose it would, I don't know, I'm speculating, composers and other people in institutions and that sort of thing that one does in an official way, in an official capacity. And so there was still sort of repression. This was in the late 70s. But the reason he came was that his father apparently moved to Israel and had remarried, and this was the reason. Now, so I'm thinking about the different influences that on the one hand he sort of kept very quiet about his Judaism. On the other hand, he had this very strong influence early on with this teacher in Timisoara, and then later, and this friendship with Haidú. Of course, Haidú became very religious in Israel and was very involved in that aspect of Jewish music. It's very strongly. Very strong sense of identity. Ligeti was the opposite. And I'm just wondering where Kurtág comes in. And then now Charles Heller mentions this anti-Semitic sort of inverted commas type of quote of a phrase, which is, clearly offensive. I'm just, it's an interesting, I don't want to answer it. The question is, where do we locate the Jewish influence or sense of identity, or perhaps avoidance of identity in Kurtág, and it obviously impacted at some point on his creativity? That's a bit of a long question. I'm not expecting an answer, but I just thought I'd raise it as a
No, it's fascinating issue.
topic.
And in the case of the Kurtág fragments also, I've thought the emphasis on the hiding places maybe fits into this history. Marta certainly lost relatives in the Holocaust. And I would like to know more about what you alluded to, Kurtág's specific Jewish background, which he hasn't, in my view and in my experience, drawn much attention to. But it seems nevertheless important. So thanks for that comment, Malcolm.
About what he was sharing with Kafka. I mean, there's Kafka also having a sort of problematic relationship with that aspect. And they mentioned the papers that were given actually to the National Library of Israel were also a sort of first strong evidence that Kafka learnt Hebrew, because it showed his exercises in learning Hebrew in the beginning of the 20th century, which was quite not a usual thing to do.
So from this perspective too, one thinks the very existence of a work like the Kafka Fragments is a kind of miracle, that Kafka's papers survived, that Max Brod could bring them out, that they reached publication, that Kurtág gradually became aware of them, that he had survived himself with his wife Marta, and that by the 1980s, 40 years ago or less, he had found the means to set them in this amazing way.
So thank you so much, Bill, for an amazing, broad and very detailed exploration and exegesis about the piece, about its background, and about its performance, and all the different aspects of it. Thanks to everybody for asking wonderful questions, probing and offering comments. And thank you for giving me the chance also to be part of this really interesting discussion. I don't know if anyone else wants to ask any more questions, but I think we're sort of near the end of the session. So I should hand over to possibly Geraldine or Mark or somebody, but hoping to see everybody after the summer break. But and I hope you all go and listen to this wonderful piece and enjoy it.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you, Bill. I'm sorry, Bill.
No, I just wanted to thank Malcolm for his skillful role.
And thank you both, and particularly thank you, Bill, for agreeing to present today. I think it was a wonderful way for our colleagues who focus on Jewish music to get to know the music of Kurtág, and I thank you for a very engaged discussion. So we really thank you all for joining us, and we're going to be on hiatus for a few months, and as you may have ideas for other presentations that you want to do or be engaged with others, we invite you to be in touch with us. And I'll turn it over to Geraldine for any final words.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have such a brilliant presentation to end off with for the second year of COZ. We've been going now for 2 years. As you can see, 85 different discussions. And to me, it is so incredible that we've got Charles in Toronto, we've got you, Mark, and Bill in Los Angeles, we've got Ronette in Israel. Where are you, Ella? And we've got people in London, Alex and Malcolm and I.
Actually, Fairfax, Virginia, but anyway.
Oh, great.
In the US. I live in the US.
Oh, you live in the US. Okay, well, it's good enough. You bring Israel into it as well. I was delighted to hear last week that many of you said that you enjoy these Tuesday evening, morning, afternoon sessions, and even though Neil said, well, maybe not every week, people said, no, but if you don't do it every week, we'll lose the momentum. And maybe Neil said, well, maybe we should shorten the presentations. And Alex Knapp was saying, no, what's wonderful about COZ is that you're not rushed and that you can listen to music and that you can speak and you can discuss. So I'm delighted that you'd like to carry on. We're going to have a long break now, but do think about presentations that you'd like to give or you'd like to see or you'd like other people. We're taking bookings now from the end of October onwards. So do get in touch with Phil or me or Mark or whoever, and hopefully we'll enjoy getting together again after a long break. So just a huge thanks to Laurie and to Mark. Laurie for organizing it, making sure that we're switched on, that we're recorded. And Mark is a wonderful partner in being able to have these sessions and create this program. And Malcolm, whose idea it was in the very first place, he said, what about having a conversation on Zoom? So it's very fitting, Malcolm, that you're also here on our very last session. So Bill, thank you so much for being our presenter with Malcolm today. Thanks, Mark, for organizing it. Thanks to everybody who's come, and we'll see you after the summer. Have a wonderful summer, everybody, but keep in touch.
Thanks to Geraldine.